Hi, I'm Senator Malcolm Roberts, Senator for Queensland, and I'm with the One Nation Party. And I'm glad that you can join me wherever you are. I'm going to go through a quick wrap-up of some notable events from the week, and then I'm going to answer your questions at the end. So send your questions in the Facebook or YouTube comments, and I'll try to get through to them. First thing out of the way quickly. If you've got anything interesting you'd like to have put on my shelf in the background here, send it to GPO Box 228, Brisbane, Queensland 4001. That's GPO Box 228, Brisbane, Queensland 4001. And address it to Senator Malcolm Roberts. If it goes on the shelf, I'll give you a shout out on this live stream. I'm going to rip through some notes here because that'll keep me focused and be more efficient. The first item I want to discuss, it's just stunning. I read about it in last weekend's newspaper, and I was just stunned. It's Chalmers' plan to fix capitalism. The Treasurer's plan to fix capitalism. He doesn't even know what capitalism is. It's a 6,000-word essay, and it's about completely changing capitalism, replacing capitalism with his version of socialism. He calls it values-based. Sounds good, doesn't it? Values-based capitalism. It's no longer capitalism if it's based on something one man or woman cooks up. Whose values? Whose values? What are those values? This is about Soviet-style command and control. That is abundantly clear. It's about implementing at a central facility, central government, the United Nations and World Economic Forum policies and controls and dictates. Now, I've written an opinion piece in response to Jim Chalmers tearing his treatise apart. I really encourage you to read my written opinion piece. What I was stunned by was the overwhelming use of buzzwords, slogans, hype. There was nothing of substance there. It was an open check. He's laying the groundwork for doing whatever he wants and saying, we told you whatever he wanted to. Luke says, how about we try something different and try some actual free, I'm with you, try some actual free market capitalism. Exactly. And I call it personal enterprise. And we'll talk more about that one day in the future. Thank you so much, Luke. You're absolutely on the money. We have not got capitalism in this country. I've worked and lived and traveled all through the United States. They do not have capitalism there. They have crony capitalism, which is really socialism. Let's talk in future about capitalism, compare it to socialism, compare it to communism, and compare it to feudalism. They're the main forms of organizing society, and we can see which is the best. It's quite clear. Personal enterprise. Sorry about that, just fixing up some audio glitches. Actually, it's a human glitch. I got the setting mixed up, so sorry about that. We've got a better microphone going now. So anyway, it's on my website, my opinion piece in response to Treasurer Jim Chalmers, and it's called Treasurer Chalmers Unleashes His Inner Soviet Dictator. Because that's what this is about. It's about going back to Soviet-style dictatorship and control of the economy, and putting it in the hands of the unelected international bureaucrats in the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. Gas prices. Gas prices and the price of electricity are going up. Queensland, gas prices up 5%. South Australia up 6%. New South Wales up 8%. Victoria up a whopping 25%. 25%. And they banned this drilling for gas in Victoria. The government has completely destroyed the energy grid in this country and exported manufacturing and jobs overseas to countries like China, who are building cheap coal-fired power, often burning our coal in their power stations. So I won't go through all the details on that. We've discussed that last week. It's important to understand that it's not just the Labor Party and the Greens and David Pocock in the Teals in the Senate. They control the Senate together. It's a Labor, Greens, Teals, Pocock coalition. But a lot of the mechanics, the foundations, the structures were put in place by the Liberal Nationals. Greg Hunt, as Minister for Climate Change and Environment, I think at the time under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, those two, with the Liberal Party support and the National Party support, put in place a safeguard mechanism, which is simply an emissions trading scheme, which is simply a carbon dioxide tax. Julia Gillard broke a promise to levy it. Tony Abbott, to his credit, rescinded it, repealed it. Malcolm Turnbull and Greg Hunt brought it back quietly just before Christmas in 2015. It was the precursor to an international global emissions trading scheme, a carbon dioxide tax. Next thing I want to discuss, I've got some notes here on the payroll tax for general practitioners, doctors. The Queensland government is rolling out a new tax on the sick. It's a tax on people who visit doctors a lot. Tax on everyone who visits doctors, but it's a tax especially on people who are sick, the elderly, young families, or families with young children, the people who can least afford it, the people on the median income and below. They're going to really struggle. It's a new ruling classifying doctors in GP practices, even where they're not employees, classifying them as employees. And that means it'll raise, I think, about 4.75% as payroll tax. Now, Pauline Hanson and I have made it very clear that payroll tax is a disastrous tax. It's inhuman tax. We all know that whenever you levy a tax on something, there will be less of it. When you levy a tax on payroll, you're levying a tax on employment. There'll be less employment. That's exactly what happens. Pauline and I have said so many times, get rid of payroll tax. It's a highly regressive tax that we should be removing completely. By the way, that reminds me, John Howard's government introduced the GST. And there was a deal done with the states. The state premier said they would remove 6 taxes. When the federal government levied the GST, there was an agreement that the states would remove 6 state taxes and that they would get the money from the GST levied by the federal government. More centralisation. Well, guess what? John Howard's GST came in, and guess what? Not one of those taxes at the state government level were removed. Not one, and they're still here. Decades later, they're still here. So GPs used to be considered contractors, not employees. They're now going to be, even if they're continuing under that role, they'll still be now levied as employees, reclassified as employees, even though it's a completely separate business. It's a tax grab from the Palaszczuk government. GPs are going to have no choice but to pass this on. They're not going to absorb it. Why should they? They're already struggling, some GPs. They're going to pass it on to us, the customer. Payroll tax, as I said a minute ago, is a highly regressive tax that needs to be removed. The more people you employ as an investor, as a small business person, as a large business, the more people you give a livelihood to, the more tax you have to pay. That's bloody ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. As well as discussing capitalism, socialism, communism, and feudalism, let's have a future chat about tax reform. It's really very, very simple, but I'll tell you what's complex about it. It's the politics. Now, for an update on alcohol bans. Well, mate, I told you so. The Alice Springs situation is terrible. But there is some hope, because it looks like the alcohol bans are going to be returned. We warned when they removed the alcohol bans. Senator Nampa Jimpa Price, you know her as Jacinda Price, warned, Karen Liddell warned, many senators warned the Labor government this would be disaster, and it's already been found out to be a disaster, exactly as we predicted. But it looks like they're going to be returned. At the moment, alcohol is going to be banned on some days and not on other days. So you can have violence on some days, but not on other days. But it looks like they're going to be more comprehensive and return the bans. The Northern Territory government was calling that racist initially, but they backflipped. It's not racist to protect people. It is basic human respect. Prime Minister Albanese was warned about this in July last year by Aboriginal people and by One Nation. I've been in all the communities in Cape York, every single community in Cape York, some 3 times or more, all of them twice. I've been on the ground and I've listened to people. I want to call out the initiatives, for example, at Lockhart River Aboriginal community. What a wonderful initiative they showed me last year. They've got a new lovely restaurant, come social centre, come bar. And they're going to be serving alcohol in ways that are respectful. And if people don't comply, they leave. This is the Aboriginal community putting these rules and restrictions in place. And that's exactly what they want to do, because they want drinking not to be binging. They want drinking to be a sociable experience with the family. And they will change that community. You watch. They're changing the system. And that's remarkable. And what I've seen across the north in Cape York and in some communities in Northern Territory is Aboriginals are crying out for some autonomy, for some accountability, for some freedom. Maria Montessori, the famous educator, said, wherever you see a lack of responsibility, you'll see a lack of freedom. See, we spend around $30 billion a year on the Aboriginal industry. And I say that Aboriginal industry because a lot of the money goes to consultants, white and black, goes to groups, goes to lawyers along the way. They feed off this. So we pay our taxes, but it doesn't get to the Aboriginal communities on the ground. And that's where it needs to go. Coming back to Alice Springs. The Labor Member of Parliament for Alice Springs is Marion Scrimgeour. She, Senator Jacinta or Nampa Jimpa Price, a dozen Aboriginal groups said removing the alcohol bans was going to end in disaster, and it has. Did the Prime Minister listen then? No. The Prime Minister doesn't listen. In fact, he went to Alice Springs after he was chased there and embarrassed into going there, and he spent 4 hours without the media so that they couldn't see any gaffes. He spent 4 hours listening to the people of Alice Springs in diabolical strife. And what we found was he spent 5 hours listening to Bill Gates. He spent 6 hours previously listening to billionaire Lindsay Fox. And he flew into Lindsay Fox's mansion on Lindsay Fox's helicopter. And he spent hours in front of the media drinking at the Australian Open last week. But just 4 hours for the people in diabolical straits in Alice Springs. Look, I've listened to the Closing the Gap speeches from Prime Minister Morrison and Opposition Leader Anthony Albanese. And then I listened, that was previous year, then I listened just in 2022 to Prime Minister Albanese and Opposition Leader Peter Dutton. And it's all bullshit. They just go through the motions. Peter Dutton came the closest to actually talking something sensible and practical and solid. But they go through this bullshit every year. They talk about closing the gap. When I was in the Torres Strait Islands just last year, one of the islanders on the council up there, I asked every council, by the way, what they think of closing the gap. No, none of them liked it. This councillor told me, a bright guy, he told me, Malcolm, they're having the closing the gap because they don't want to close the gap. That's how the consultants, the lawyers, the predators feed off our Aboriginal money that's been given to us by the taxpayers. They feed off that. They want the gap to be there forever because whatever the gap is there, they will be getting money. And it doesn't go to the communities, it goes to these parasites, these thieves. So on the voice to Parliament, it won't fix anything because it won't change gutless politicians who only care about looking good. Politicians in this country mostly care about looking good, not about doing good. The voice will not change that. There is nothing more racist than dividing us on race. That is the definition of racism. So as a good mate of mine, John McRae, said to me a couple of weeks ago, until I know, vote no. So vote no to the voice. Until you know the details, vote no. Last part of the wrap-up. Regional and rural bank branches are being closed down by greedy, manipulative bankers, thieves, trying to force people into online banking in areas where there's no online banking. Small towns are being left with no banking services. Businesses are having to hold and carry cash, extra cash, which is unsafe. And what they're doing is moving the risk from banks holding money to small businesses. That's what we pay banks for, to have that risk. But they're abrogating it. They want the money, they want the fees, but they don't want to do the work. Businesses are trying to deposit cash. Businesses that are trying to deposit cash are being told, go away, we don't want your cash here. And those businesses are driving around town with large sums of money banks don't want to hold. But they want it when they want it. This is what it's about. It's about destroying services, forcing people onto online, eventually forcing people onto digital, central bank digital currency. Reserve Bank's already admitted that. And they've already admitted that they are dealing with international banks, overseas central banks, about coming up with a global central bank currency, global currency. What we need is cash, and we need an Australia Post Bank. And I want to acknowledge the many councils that have moved motions of support for an Australia Post Bank, just like in Japan, just like in New Zealand, and just like the bank, the old Commonwealth Bank as it was many years ago. We need a People's Bank, and the best form of that at the moment is the Australia Post Bank. So that's the wrap up. Boy. So I'll now go to your questions. Send them in the comments section on Facebook and YouTube. Dale Jackson, show us the contracts we signed for the vax, ? Yes, mate, that's what we chased when the Morrison government was in government. It's what we voted for when a Liberal senator, Senator Antic, Alex Antic, moved a motion just a few months ago with the Labor government saying we want to see the contracts. In both times, the Morrison government said no to seeing the contracts. The Albanese government said, with the Greens and with some of the crossbench, said no to seeing the contracts. Taxpayers, that's us, you guys, me, we're all the taxpayers. We paid for these bloody injections, these COVID injections, but we can't see the contracts. What are the liabilities? What are the risks? Not just the medical risks, but the commercial risks. What about the doctors? Are they indemnified or not? So we want to see the contracts that our government signed on our behalf. As taxpayers, we signed that through our government. So we have been, and we'll keep chasing those contracts. We've had lessons in recent weeks about another alternative on how to get the contracts, and we will keep trying until we get the damn things. Marcus, how can the gas prices be going up when we are one of the largest exporters in the world? Exactly. Not just one of the largest gas exporters, we are the largest exporters of natural gas in the world. We pipped Qatar. If you want to know the answer to that, go and listen to some of Senator Hanson's speeches many, many years ago. Bob Hawke, the Labor Prime Minister, and Paul Keating, the Labor Treasurer, put in place the Petroleum Rent Resources Tax. It means that the largest multinational evaders of tax in the world, that's Chevron, along with other companies that are major multinational tax evaders, will never pay tax, never pay company tax for the gas they export. That's why, because of Bob Hawke's Petroleum Rent Resources Tax. Not only that, the major exporters are supposed to reserve a certain amount of gas for our own domestic use. They haven't been doing that. So we're getting shafted. Drecker says, we need to stop immigration. I agree. And yet One Nation support PS it. Or supports it. No, we need to drop immigration dramatically. Both the Labor Party, the Greens, the Liberal Nationals support an increase in immigration to around about 250 in the case of the Liberal Nationals, 250,000 a year. And in the case of the Labor Greens, 300,000 a year. What we've said all along is that we have on average, about 70,000 people leave Australia. So what we're saying is allow 70,000 in to replace them so that we have a net zero. The same amount leave as come in. So we have net zero immigration. Net zero. That's what we want. Net zero. We want that to remove pressure from housing prices, move pressure on infrastructure, restore basic services, plan ahead for the future, and once we catch up with those, then maybe consider increases in immigration. We also want to recognize that the use of immigration is a trick that's used economically by it's an economic trick used by the Liberal Nationals and the Labor Greens. Because when you bring in people who are going to consume services, it adds to consumption in the marketplace. If not for immigration and the numbers, the consumption being inflated, we would have been in recession for many of the past years. Before COVID, we would have been in recession. What it does when you get the extra people coming in with immigration is it suppresses wages. That's why we don't have real wage growth. And yet at the same time now, due to COVID mismanagement, gross mismanagement, we've got a shortage of workers in many industries. So we're going to see some quite tumultuous economic times, a lot of turmoil, because things are not balanced and things are not appropriate for our country. But that means also we shouldn't just stop there. We should be looking at our tax system. Why aren't Australians working? In large part, it's because of the tax system and the overly generous welfare systems with limited accountability. Jacqueline Brooks says, why is Russia to blame for the massive increase in gas? Russia is not to blame for the massive increases in gas. The Europeans have become dependent on Russian gas supplies. They've so far refused to take gas, or they've said they will refuse to take gas from the Russians, which means that other suppliers around the world have had to increase their have had to see an increase in gas consumption, gas demand, so they've raised prices. That's it, simple. A lot of what we're told about the Ukraine conflict is rubbish, and that's another one. We've also had a pipeline from Russia to Europe, to Western Europe, blown up. So that has also put pressure on gas prices. The Russians didn't blow up their own pipeline. So there's a lot of rubbish and lies being spread by the mouthpiece media. So they're spreading those lies about COVID, they're spreading those lies about climate, they're spreading those lies about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There's a lot we should know about that, but the mouthpiece media won't tell us. I alone was the only senator when the previous foreign minister, Maurice Payne, introduced a censure motion against the Russians for rolling tanks across the border into Ukraine. Everyone else said, get in there, get stuck into the Ruskies. I just said, let's stop before we go anywhere and ask some basic questions. No one is asking questions. Do we need to follow the Americans into yet another war? We've done that so many times. We need to stop and think about what is good for our country. We've got nothing to do with a conflict in Eastern Europe. Kimmy, we should all boycott big banks. Take our money out now, cash all the way. Yes and no. Cash definitely all the way. We've got to keep cash. It was my office that stopped the cash ban bill. We stopped the cash ban bill and got it moved out of the Senate altogether. But now it's a digital identity bill that the previous government, the Morrison-Joyce government, introduced into the public discussion. It didn't introduce it into Parliament. We think it'll come back with the Labor Party sometime. But they're forever trying to get rid of cash, because when you get rid of cash, you've got a digital currency to replace it. When it's a digital currency, they can then quickly move to a social credit system, and then they can control everything you do. So yes, by all means, boycott the big banks. And while we're at it, let's boycott big media. Let's get back to regional media, private media, independent media, podcasters. Let's take our money out of the big banks now, use cash, but you can also store cash in one of the small regional banks, the customer-owned banks, wonderful institutions. And let's get the Australia Post Bank, the People's Bank, back up and running. Matt, he has a question. You will own nothing and be happy. How do you think the govs will take owned properties from us? Well, Matt, they do it in many, many ways. But before going on to that doomy answer, gloomy answer, sorry, let's think about something else. I've forgotten the American commentator, but it's something I've come to realize in recent weeks. This World Economic Forum mob is absolutely hopeless. They're now fighting within themselves, and if you look, the pressure we have been putting them under publicly, in case of my office and Pauline's office, for many years, and intensely for the last 3 years, actually before COVID, so 4 years, has starting to pay off. People are now talking openly about it. Nigel Farage, who's got a ton of guts, he came to Australia at the CPAC conference, and he had a wonderful speech. Good man, very good man, ton of guts. But he was a bit reticent to use the words World Economic Forum and a few other things. Well, we blew that out of the water. We have used them boldly, and he's now jumped on board. Thank you, Nigel. But other people have jumped on board. It is now common for people to be talking out about the gutless, incompetent, inhuman, anti-human World Economic Forum and the UN. People are now awake to the globalists. And when you see them in operation, they're highly incompetent. They're just smug, self-declared elites who think that they know the answers to how to run the world and what we all need. That will bring them undone. We've seen from the World Economic Forum in Davos a remarkable awakening around the world. People are just laughing at these bastards, and they deserve our scorn and our ridicule. So how do you think the governments will own properties from us? Well, let's have a look at property rights. In 1997, the United Nations Kyoto Protocol came into place. John Howard was the Prime Minister of a Liberal national government. Just remember that. Rob Borbidge was the Premier of the Queensland State Government, a National Party government. I think he was in coalition with the Liberals. So we had Liberal National in federal, Liberal National at state. Now John Howard's government said, we won't sign the UN Kyoto Protocol, but we will abide by it. They had a problem. How do you shut down industry? How do you stop people using cars? How do you stop people with agriculture without there being a revolt? He recognized, or that the government recognized, there would be a problem. So what they did was a deal with the United Nations. They agreed that if they stopped farmers clearing land, that those trees that are left will continue to absorb carbon dioxide. So instead of clearing land, if they prevented the clearing of land, that would be trees saved to absorb carbon dioxide. Mind you, the whole thing is bullshit. The whole of this climate scam is exactly that. So they had a problem though. If you stop farmers clearing the land that they bought with the intent of possibly clearing it and upgrading their agricultural productivity, then you have interfered with the property rights of those farmers. You have stolen their right to use their land as they see fit. That's exactly what they paid for. When you buy property, you actually buy the right to use that property. It's a subtle difference, but that's what's happening. If you want to choose to build a house on it, that's your right, providing it complies with the conditions of the purchase. You have a right to use that property as you want. So the federal government had a problem because Section 51, Clause 31 of the Federal Constitution says if the federal government interferes with anyone's rights to use their property, they must pay just terms compensation. The Howard government had a huge problem on its hands. That would have cost $200 billion or more in property in just terms compensation. So John Howard's government managed to steal the property rights of farmers around the country by going to the state government, doing a deal with the state government. So the state government stole farmers' land, rights to use their land, without paying compensation. The first government they went to was Queensland, the National Party government. And I've seen the document. 3 signatures from the Liberal Nationals in federal parliament, 3 signatures from the National Liberals in state government in Queensland, agreeing to do this deal. The Prime Minister and the Premier, the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Premier, and the Environment Minister and the Environment Minister. All 6 Liberal Nationals. They stole farmers' rights to use their land. Then in came Peter Beattie, the Labor Premier in 1998, and they ramped it up. The Howard government gave hundreds of millions of dollars of our taxes to the Beattie government to do as they want, open-ended, so long as the Beattie government put in place native vegetation protection legislation to stop the clearing of land. Then it was a very simple matter. They'd already stolen it. Then it was a matter of the Beattie government applying more restrictions on farmers' rights to use their land. Then I think, what was the government after that? The Bligh government put more restrictions and tightened it up. Then the Newman government came in, the Liberal National government, and they didn't add any more, but they didn't rescind anything. Then we had the Palaszczuk government come in, and 3 times now they have jacked it up and increased the controls on farmers' land. They have stolen the farmers' rights to use their land. So what we've got is basic theft. And in New South Wales, the same happened. Bob Carr was the Labor Party Environment Minister and then Premier. He gloated on YouTube. I've seen him. I've seen the YouTube video. It's been removed and now it's added again with just a voice. But it is Bob Carr's voice. And he was gloating, laughing at stealing, helping the Howard government steal farmers' rights to use their land, stealing farmers' property rights. Peter Beattie, I've seen a letter from Peter Beattie to John Howard saying that he will agree to steal the farm, didn't use that word of course, to take farmers' rights to use their land in exchange for John Howard being able to comply with the UN's dictates on Kyoto. That's how they do it. They put in place legislation to steal your property rights. This is not just about farmers. Just up the road up here, I'm pointing north, just up the road up here, there is a person who's had a lot of land in a suburban area. When I say a lot of land, a few blocks, not just one block. And he decided now he's been well into retirement, he would sell a large part of it. The council, this is not in Brisbane, this is in Caboolture, the council stole a big portion of one of those blocks as a recreational area. They didn't pay him compensation. Now look, I've got no problem with a council or a state government or a federal government taking someone's land and making it a public access area or protecting the land for public use, whatever they want to call it. But you don't steal it. You get the community to pay for it, or you get the taxpayers to pay for it. You don't steal it off someone. In Mossman, down south in Sydney, I know someone there. We'll get to you, Brett. Mossman, there are restrictions on how much area you can pave in your own backyard and how much must be grass. This is rubbish. Bureaucrats know bugger all. And it's the homeowner who will pay the price if the bureaucrats get it wrong. So we need to give property rights back to the individuals. So that, I hope Matt will explain how they steal property rights. But they do it in many, many ways. They reclassify zones. They steal the various rights to use things. So that's how they steal property rights. And they can do the same with just about anything. Brett, here we go. Matt is owned by the coal, Malcolm is owned by the coal industry. Don't believe a word he says. Love your argument, mate. Great logic. Plenty of good data there. How does the coal industry own me? It doesn't. I've been highly critical of the coal industry executives for giving up on this climate change bullshit. Highly critical of them in public. I've never got a cent from the coal industry as a politician or as an individual citizen. I have taken money from the coal industry as an employee, just as you do, I hope, from your employer. I've worked as a volunteer for around 14 years fighting this climate rubbish. I didn't get a cent from anyone. In fact, the Galileo movement, when they took me on as project manager, they said, let's negotiate salary. And I said, I will not take a single cent because I want to be above all that. I don't want anyone to say that I'm funded. And I said the second condition on which I'll work, so I'll work for you on 2 conditions. I'll lead your project on 2 conditions. One is that I work as a volunteer, and secondly, that we not only discuss the science, we discuss the corruption of climate science. So Brett, next time, mate, come armed with some facts and don't just try to smear people. When people smear or ridicule, then what they're really doing is saying to me they don't have the facts to oppose my argument on climate change. They don't have my facts, in your case, to oppose me on anything. Thanks, mate, for declaring me the winner of the debate on climate change. Merkmad, if climate change were real, no finance company would ever lend money for land in Brisbane. Correct. It's not real. people who are noted climate alarmists around the world, Al Gore, Barack Obama, Tim Flannery, live on the ocean shores or on tidal estuary shores. This is fact. So we've seen that this is a scam. Tides are not going anywhere. Sea levels are not going anywhere. And you're absolutely right. In Florida, they've worked out that it's a way to try and get beachside property by scaring people out, and then with the new owners buying it cheaply, they lend them money. And by the way, going back to one of the previous questions about how they steal property, I was in New South Wales briefly one weekend. This is a few years ago. And I heard a story about people in Lake Cat-Eye. An 80-year-old couple in Lake Cat-Eye. It's a town on the coast. They're 7 meters above sea level. They've got a cliff in front of them. The whole of their street was between them and the beach, as well as some grassland as well. They were told that they would be evicted along with everyone in their short street, about 8 houses or so. So I got wind of that, and I drove to Brisbane and I called in on the locals and learned about what was going on. Then we spread the facts. Then I wrote a pretty strong letter to the local council, which was the Port Macquarie Hastings Shire Council. It was under administration at the time. And I got Alan Jones involved, and he gave them a blast, and my letter put them well and truly into a difficult position, because not only were they stealing this land based on UN climate claims, which is complete rubbish, the same council authorised multi-million-dollar properties in a lake and river estuary right on sea level. The properties already flood due to when they've got very high floods. The council authorises flooding, development in flood-prone areas, and wants to steal the land of an 80-year-old couple that had spent years saving money, a mechanic he was, saving money to retire peacefully. That's what's going on in our country, because we're taking orders from the United Nations. Peter, yes, get the inland rail to Gladstone built, yes. Someone needs to show some balls and build a new heli in Queensland. Everything's in place. Pauline Hanson and I have long advocated for a heli coal-fired power station in Collinsville, North Queensland. We could do with another coal-fired power station. We also need the, Copper String 2 to be built to deliver power to Mount Isa and open up the whole area there for mining of rare earths and other valuable minerals. Now, coming back to the inland rail to Gladstone, we've done a lot of work on the inland rail. It's been built in the wrong place, south of the Queensland border. The projected route across the Condamine floodplain is terrible. It's a really serious problem. So what we've been saying is it needs to go instead from New South Wales up through to Gladstone, inland to Gladstone. It had actually far better service for the whole of Queensland, far better service for the whole of Australia, because the logistics with regard to the Gladstone port, the rail from Toowoomba to Brisbane, lots of problems. Go from Gladstone to Melbourne, that's what we need. And we'll talk about the Iron Boomerang on another occasion, because the Iron Boomerang almost completes a national rail circuit. And that's what we need for manufacturing security, energy security, access to opening up the inland Australia, giving Aboriginal communities water, optic fibre connections, and it also opens up security as well as industry and agriculture. It vastly improves costs for agriculture in Central Australia and Northern Australia. Rail is wonderful. We need to start getting back to basics and making decisions in this country based on data. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be back next week, all things being equal. I've got to mention one thing. I may not go to Parliament early next week, because our daughter is having our first grandchild. It's supposed to be today, but she's late. So we'll see what's going to happen. But I'll stay here until she has her baby. But other than that, we'll come back to you after Parliament next week. All the best until then.